Aging. One of life's greatest conundrums, aging has stuck with us humans for as long as at least 10. Or, that's as far as I can finger count. Not many people appreciate it, but everybody does it. Kinda like making very subpar content with virtually no consistent schedule. What? Really? Just me? Huh. Okay. Anyway, it's well known by many that at a certain point in life, aging kinda starts to suck. Birthdays become less of a fun-filled party and more of my youth is ever escaping me, my bright future's becoming my darkened past, But, you know, aging also has its perks. With age comes many things. Wisdom, knowledge, a sudden urge to become overly invested in college football and drink copious amounts of soda water. While not perfect, aging isn't all bad, and that doesn't just apply to people. While they don't usually become overly invested in college football and drink copious amounts of soda water, video games age just like people do. From as early as the late 1960s, video games have continued to leap from computer terminals and given us gamers a plethora of things to play, hanging around and giving us entertainment for decades. However, some of you keen-eyed folks may have noticed that Elden Ring doesn't exactly play like Pong, and of course, that's because games have changed a lot since their creation. Starting from 2 digital sticks and a pixel and going to that, video games have definitely experienced a lot of change over time. And boy does that statement hold truest with roguelikes. Roguelikes are a very interesting genre in this way. From their cementation as a genre in the 1980s and on for almost 2 decades, roguelikes actually stayed pretty consistent in terms of gameplay, with most sharing similar gameplay mechanics accompanied by dungeon crawler vibes and mixed with a couple of their own unique settings or mechanics. Roguelikes were a very rinse and repeat genre in this way, as many new roguelikes that were created always seemed to feel similar to their predecessors. And while roguelikes certainly weren't just identical to each other, many did follow a very similar formula when it came to gameplay, graphics, settings, and the such. And of course, that pattern of similarity in roguelikes would continue to be consistent for nearly 2 decades. And then roguelikes died. Okay, maybe that's a very, very big hyperbole, but roguelikes are in fact nowadays kinda, well, gone. You see that roguelike over there? Not a roguelike. You see that roguelike over there? Not a roguelike. You see that roguelike over there? Oh, wait, that actually is a roguelike. My bad. Point being, those roguelikes aren't actually roguelikes. In fact, the actual roguelike genre has been steadily drowned out for the past decade and a half, to the point that roguelikes have seemingly vanished from the mainstream position they once held in the past. But how, you may ask? I mean, if those games aren't roguelikes, then what are they? And if the genre is, quote, dead, then what the heck happened to roguelikes? Well, I'll tell ya. Right here, right now. Well, once the music fades out. Any second now. There it goes. So, roguelikes. How could they possibly be gone, and what happened to them? Well, it's a bit of a long story, so long that it covers several decades of the past. So, appropriately, I think we should probably start, well, in the past, by discussing the roots of this whole discussion, the roguelike. The actual roguelike. So, let's head back to the 1980s, baby. Guns N' Roses, Beastie Boys, AC/DC. Yeah, that makes it sound like I know the 80s. Amid the rock and roll, techno music, and questionable fads of the 80s, this time period also housed one of the most defining video games of video game history. A little game that went on to define its own entire genre and a huge basis for this entire video, Rogue. Rogue is considered by many to be the game that created the roguelike genre. While it certainly wasn't the first iteration of the roguelike genre, many people credit it as the spark that ignited the roguelike genre, as its creation led to the creation of many games similar to it, and eventually, this led to the foundation of the roguelike genre. So before we can understand roguelikes and what happened to them, we gotta understand Rogue. But what is Rogue, you may ask? Well, Rogue was a tiny little game released way back in 1980, made by 2 guys you probably never heard of, plus 1 more guy later on. Certainly not the expected start of one of the most influential gaming genres in history, but a start nonetheless. The game itself is a top-down dungeon crawler that involves your unnamed thing traversing the dungeon around you, continually progressing down it to reach the end, the Amulet of Yendor. It's turn-based, tile-based, action-y, and full of low-res, or text-res, I guess, adventuring, which makes it seem like it should have just blended into the massive dungeon crawlers that emerged in the late 70s and early 80s, but it had a couple very unique things about it that made it stand out. For one, it was an ASII title, which gave it a hefty audience of computer-savvy college kids. But, more importantly for this video, it had some pretty interesting mechanics apart from other dungeon crawlers of its time. First off, it had permadeath. which meant that every time you died, you would be reset all the way to the beginning of the game and have to replay with none of the things you collected along your initial run and with no save points or anything of the likes to start from. Kinda similar to arcade games at the time with a game over. In addition, it had procedural generation, which meant that every time you replayed the game from death, you were met with a brand new randomly generated dungeon to scour through. These two mechanics were not entirely unheard of at the time, as several other games, namely arcade ones, had one or even both, but the way they were combined on a non-arcade game, along with its ASII nature and the Dungeons & Dragons vibes it had, made Rogue special. It was a dungeon crawler, but you went through a randomly generated dungeon on every single playthrough, and were sent all the way back to the beginning of the game with no collectibles every time you died. It was certainly a bit of a novel for the time, and it caught on pretty quickly for that, growing in popularity relatively soon after its release. Rogue's growing popularity then led to the creation of many other games that followed its signature formula of dungeon crawler permadeath procedural generation game. Eventually, so many of these games came about that dungeon crawler permadeath procedural generation game was decided to be a kinda bad name. But since these new games were not similar enough to pre-existing genres at the time to really be put into one of those genres, a new designation was given to dungeon crawler permadeath procedural generation games, roguelikes. And so, the roguelike genre was born, and from there, roguelikes flowed from the fountains of game devs, blessing us gamers with fun, unique, and engaging games for decades, with popular titles such as NetHack, Moria, Angbang, etc. So, that's it would seem. Roguelikes continue to be made and of course are still a prominent genre nowadays. Wrong. Because you've been bamboozled. You see, what you probably think are roguelikes nowadays aren't actually roguelikes, because the transition from roguelikes in the 20th century and early 2000s to roguelikes nowadays isn't quite so simple. In fact, you might be surprised to hear that roguelikes were basically swept out from the mainstream right under your nose, and replaced with imposters. Imposters that go by a very familiar name, but are not roguelikes. Imposters called Among... I can't even finish that joke. No matter how many takes I do. I'm sorry. Imposters called roguelikes. Roguelikes are kind of like that blue mold on a piece of cheese. You know that all the cheese is mold, but there's that extra blue stuff on it that you never really notice at first, but as it sits over time, it seems to crop up everywhere. What? Really? I'm the only one who leaves food by their bed for 3 days and then remembers it's there and tries to eat it, worried about wasting it? Okay, I really gotta work on these metaphors, I guess. Jeez. Anyway, roguelikes aren't moldy cheese and certainly aren't bad, but they are nonetheless a little tricky. I bet you're probably wondering right now, how are these games that I claim to not be roguelikes actually roguelites? And what even is a roguelite? And how did they, quote, get rid of roguelikes? I mean, the roguelite seems like the same thing as the roguelike. The names literally have a one-letter difference. Well, the difference between them is actually much larger than one letter. And this transformation from roguelike to roguelite is probably one of the most intriguing evolutions in a genre in gaming history. At least to me. Let's head back in time for this part, to the 20th century. Roguelikes are doing well and prosperous in the 80s and 90s, with many sticking to the revered Rogue formula. But pause, what is that formula, actually? I mean, you may be able to see one of those games and think, oh, that's a roguelike. But what are the actual qualities of a roguelike? You might find that it's a little harder to pinpoint as opposed to other genres. Like, oh, FPS is person shooting gun in first person. And oh, platformer is thing go move and jump. Roguelikes, on the other hand, weren't exactly that simple due to their unique nature and gameplay mechanics, and there's actually a whole dang list of qualifications for what counted as a roguelike. According to a consensus made in the International Roguelike Development Conference of 2008, often called the Berlin Interpretation, which is applicable to all the roguelikes made before and after 2008, these requirements included random environment generation, permadeath, turn-based combat, grid-based in general, non-modal, complex, requiring resource management, being a hack and slash, and emphasis on exploration and discovery. Yeah, just a few rules. While these qualifications were not necessarily concrete, it was just so hard to really define the genre that there were a lot of qualities that were deemed to be essential to describe a game as a roguelike, in the attempt to pinpoint the naturally kinda subjective nature of the genre. It was so subjective, in fact, that even the steadfast Berlin interpretation was contested on some occasions, with several other definitions, such as the traditional roguelike definition, giving their take on the parameters of what counted as a roguelike, as opposed to the Berlin. However, in spite of all that, honestly, roguelikes and defining them went pretty well back then, for a key reason. People knew what roguelikes were because most games stayed close to the realm of the Berlin Interpretation's rules, with their own slight variations to make their games unique. This made it easier to define what was and wasn't a roguelike, while also enabling roguelike creators to have some leniency when deciding what qualities were going to be in their roguelike, since all the Berlin Interpretation rules were not really required because the games often had most of them. But eventually, someone had to break the rules, and break the rules someone, or many someones, did, with the invention that started the downfall of the roguelike, the roguelites. Starting in the late 2000s with titles like Spelunky, Rogue Legacy, and The Binding of Isaac, some new roguelikes began to hit the block, but they weren't exactly following the rules. Sure, they had permadeath and procedural generation like all other roguelikes at that point, but that was where the similarities began to stop. Instead of the iconic turn-based combat and grid movement, these new roguelikes featured real-time combat, free movement, platforming, and even some new camera perspectives. They had some properties of roguelikes, but they weren't exactly fully roguelikes, in that they didn't follow a majority of the rules of an actual roguelike defined by the Berlin Interpretation. Now, of course, as I said before, roguelikes before then were given leniency on some Berlin Interpretation rules, but these new roguelikes straight up ditched pretty much all of them except for permadeath and procedural generation, making them fundamentally different from their roguelike predecessors. However, despite their differences, these new roguelikes quickly rose to become incredibly well received and critically acclaimed by both the roguelike community and a plethora of new fans, with many sparking the interest of thousands of tens of thousands of players. Suddenly, these new roguelikes were making rounds on the indie landscape, with several titles being deemed some of the best games of the decade. And while that was great for these new roguelikes, this huge burst of popularity of them created a conundrum of what to name these new partial roguelikes. The obvious solution appeared to be to label them as roguelikes. However, people realized that labeling them roguelikes could get kinda confusing. These partial roguelikes seemed to be roguelikes, but they lacked many of the definitive qualities under the Berlin Interpretation and similar interpretations to be roguelikes. But other roguelikes before then had broken some rules of the Berlin Interpretation, and yet they were called roguelikes, so these new roguelikes shouldn't be any different, right? Well, these new partial roguelikes broke so many of the Berlin qualifications that they just couldn't really be called roguelikes, as pretty much no other roguelikes by that point had ever deviated so far from the standard roguelike build. It was obvious that a whole new term was needed to label these new partial roguelikes. So, a new word, coined by the game Rogue Legacy, was created to sort these games into roguelikes. As opposed to roguelikes, roguelikes' only required mechanics were permadeath and procedural generation. These were the very, very core mechanics of all roguelikes, including games from the 80s until nowadays, so they had to stay to make a roguelike similar enough to a roguelike to be similar. But beyond that, the sky was the limit as to what the game could be. It could be 2D, 3D isometric, fully 3D, a shooter, a hack and slash, a Zelda-esque dungeon crawler, a campaign-driven space story about amnesia and aliens, etc. While most roguelites did end up following the pattern of real-time action-adventure, there was theoretically no real limit as to what a roguelike could be, so long as it had that permadeath and procedural generation as main mechanics. And so, with this new field of creative potential, roguelites shot off, with tons being produced in the late 2000s and on, and many rising to astounding fame. In fact, roguelites got so popular that several roguelites hit the mainstream media, something that roguelikes had fallen out of for the most part by the 2000s. These roguelites were all just so awesome. A great blend of classical roguelike mechanics mixed with some great fresh new ideas and gameplay, creating a both familiar yet new experience to roguelike veterans, and just a great general playing experience to anyone regardless of their familiarity to the roguelike genre. It's no wonder roguelites reached the massive amount of people they did, and with their massive popularity, in a sense, roguelites became the hip new roguelikes. And so, that brings us back to roguelites, which kinda got the short end of the stick in the whole roguelike craze. Roguelikes were still being made at this point and had a healthy player base, but with the newfound success of roguelites, roguelikes were being drowned out, with many more roguelites coming out and gaining a sizable player base compared to roguelikes. Now, of course, this is not an indication that roguelikes were bad or anything compared to roguelites, as roguelikes were and still are awesome and definitely still had people in the genre making and playing them. But compared to roguelites, well, they kinda got shoved out of the spotlight. The roguelike genre certainly still, to this day, has a great player base and awesome new games being made in it. But I think it can't really be denied that that base is comparatively smaller than roguelite's player base, to the point that roguelites consume the very name of their roguelike predecessor. This is what I think really nailed the coffin for roguelikes, as nowadays, roguelites are often just called roguelikes. The roguelike genre has grown so much over the past decade and a half that they have in essence become the new roguelike, and that's just sort of been accepted by the roguelike community. Nowadays, you may see many reviews and online discussions of roguelikes call their game in question a roguelike, and I even do that sometimes, which is technically wrong, but understood nonetheless by viewers, as many people have taken the roguelike genre to be the same thing as the roguelike genre, in large part because of how few actual roguelikes there are in the spotlight compared to roguelites. This change of naming has led to most actual roguelikes being delegated to terms like traditional or true roguelike, which I think really signals that they are part of a sort of bygone era, a past that has been overtaken by the present roguelites. That doesn't mean that all roguelikes are just old games, of course, but I think that the growing popularity of roguelites, along with the falling popularity of roguelikes, has led to roguelikes being viewed as a thing of the past, in favor of a new roguelike, the roguelites. Now, is that a bad thing? I don't think so myself, as the roguelike player base is still there, and great awesome roguelikes are still being made to this day, along with the already great existing ones. But, to be fair, perhaps this decline of roguelikes from the public eye could lead to smaller and smaller interest in roguelikes in favor of roguelites, until roguelikes are truly an era of the bygone past, the old foundation to the potential current real roguelike, the roguelites. But, I don't know, maybe that won't happen. Maybe roguelite and roguelike, or I guess roguelike and traditional roguelike, can coexist and appeal to a wider base of fans. Maybe not. I'm not a gypsy. So, that begs my question. What do you think about roguelikes? Are they really part of a bygone era? And was I right to assume that roguelikes have taken their mantle? What thoughts do you have about roguelikes nowadays? Please let me know in the comments. Oh, hey. Don't mind me, I'm just sitting here in this metal bunker, preparing for a potential spam attack in the comments of how wrong I am and that I hate roguelikes even though I think they're pretty cool. I'll be in here for a while. Anyway, see you in the next video, maybe. Bye.